A dog's purpose. How the human assertion of a dog's purpose as family or weapon perpetuates and expands the human-nature divide. Introduction. The dog has been a part of human life for thousands of years. Throughout their cohabiting and domestication, dogs have formed strong social and kinship relations with humans. In the contemporary world, dog domestication has evolved into selective breeding, wherein certain traits are prioritized and reproduced in dog offspring. Additionally, in these relations, it has become common practice for humans to assert what the purpose of the dog is. This entails the human deciding which behaviors are desirable and acceptable, training the dog for and against certain behaviors, and overall using the dog for a specific purpose. The human assertion of a dog's purpose stems from colonial ideologies that devalue the dog and fail to recognize it as an animal with its own agency, subjectivities, and epistemologies. As a result, and as this essay will argue, this assertion perpetuates and expands the human-nature divide, which is exemplified and manufactured through the provision of flexible personhood unto the dog and the weaponization of the dog. In an attempt to destabilize this colonial mindset and to challenge the human-nature divide, I have sought to view and write the dog as an equal and active participant and knowledge producer. This project takes the form of a research ethnography and includes reference to the data I collected, as well as short vignettes from my research at the beginning of each content section of this essay. In this essay, I will first discuss the ethical considerations that underpinned my ethnographic research project and the research methods that were used in the process of data collection. I will then briefly outline the limits of this project and the ways in which these limits might be addressed. Following this, I will discuss how this project, born out of an anti-anthropocentric anthropology, contributes to the decolonial project. Next, I will discuss the human assertion of the purpose of dogs. I will then discuss the two ways in which this purpose is asserted. Firstly, by the provision of flexible personhood unto the dog, and secondly, by the weaponization of dogs for protection and as a threatening image. I will conclude having shown that the human assertion of the dog's purpose perpetuates and expands the human-nature divide.
Good morning.
Ethics.
Good morning.
Maintaining and ensuring ethical and moral considerations has been of the utmost importance throughout this ethnographic research project. These considerations have guided the research process from defining the research question, throughout my data collection, in the data analysis, and in the write-up of this report. Using the ethical guidelines and principles of conduct for anthropologists as it is outlined in Anthropology Southern Africa, and the ethical guidelines for the use of animals in research as it is outlined by the Norwegian National Committee for Research Ethics in Science and Technology, I have created a framework that would guide my processes. Unfortunately, I found that these guidelines are outdated and limited, and therefore need to be adjusted and refocused for my individual project. As outlined in Anthropology Southern Africa, my primary responsibility as an anthropologist is to the research participants who are invaluable contributors to my research. In the case of my project, these participants include both the human and the non-human, that is, the dog. Both of these groups are equally valuable, valid, and important knowledge producers and contributors to this project. As stated in my introduction, the goal of this research project is to challenge anthropocentrism, and so it has remained essential that all ethical considerations be applicable to both the human and the non-human. It is my responsibility as an anthropologist to protect these participants and anticipate harm to the best of my ability. As a result, I have chosen to omit all names in this research project for both the dog and the human participants, and I have used pseudonyms in their place. Informed consent was another important ethical consideration, especially because the non-human participants would not be able to provide verbal or written consent to take part in the research project. The dog, as a research participant, must be respected and treated with dignity and its own agency, as I would treat a human participant. In lieu of verbal and written consent for the non-human participants, I took to observing the animal's behavior in reaction to my presence in their space, as an indication of their willingness to participate in this project. This meant greeting the dog, allowing it to approach me, and respecting any boundaries that it put in place that might have distanced myself from them or their owner, such as barking at me or ignoring me. For the human participants, I requested either signed or verbal consent following description of my research project, its goals, and an explanation as to how their responses would be used. The third ethical consideration is about the vulnerability of my research participants. I have come to understand the dog as a vulnerable group at risk of having its voice appropriated, misused, and misunderstood. It is my responsibility as the anthropologist to avoid risking this vulnerability and to ensure that this vulnerability is not abused to meet research ends. In his article for the Annual Review of Anthropology, Culloch argues that misunderstanding dog behavior is frequent in everyday life and in research. So taking steps to avoid appropriating the voice of the dog has been essential for this project. In my data collection, I made the effort to acknowledge the sense experiences of the dog and have used these as a guide to develop and understand the voice of the dog. The vulnerability of human participants has also remained a consideration. I have sought to avoid shaming or allowing judgment towards the research participants for the beliefs and views they hold as they are discussed in this project.
Bye-bye, have a good day.
Methods. As this research forms part of a third-year undergraduate anthropology course, there were multiple research methods required for the completion of this project. This included ethnographic interviews, participant observation, a focus group, use of visual data, and the gathering of literature. I have also included the use of a survey and the creation of a soundscape to supplement these research methods. As this research is a multi-species ethnography, all of these methods will be centered around and guided by this multi-species concept. The survey asked several questions about the participants' individual experiences with and around dogs. This included questions about the purpose of the dog and the use of the dog for personal protection. I received 10 responses to this survey, and while this is not enough to make any statistical claims, this did provide valuable insight into how people understand my research topic. The ethnographic interviews were far more successful as they allowed me to interview a wide demographic of dog owners and to also observe the dogs in the process. I conducted a total of 6 ethnographic interviews. 3 of these were walking interviews in a public park, much like that described by Ellis et al. One was with a personal protection dog trainer. One was with a dog owner who regularly trains their dogs in the manner of sport, and the last was with a friend who is a dog owner. The participant observation was conducted over 10 hours and in multiple field sites that included a neighborhood and public park in Cape Town and a canine training center in Epping. Multiple field sites allowed for increased exposure to a variety of views from research participants on human and dog relationships. The focus group took place at the University of Cape Town with 3 participants. In the focus group, we discussed 5 topics that I had found to be of interest following my previous data collection. I also collected photographs and videos in the data collection. I found that these were useful means to capture some of the experiences of the dog participants because these encouraged a focus on sensory data to understand the dog. I found that collecting visual data allowed me to connect to the dog through our shared experiences of being embodied beings in the world. Gathering literature included the gathering of both grey and academic literature. The academic literature has formed the basis of my theoretical understanding and approach to this research and is guided by a few key authors including Vitesh and Cherney. The grey literature has served to supplement how I understand the way people view and experience dogs, and the novel The Art of Racing in the Rain by Garth Stein, written from the perspective of a dog, has aided in my approach to the creative expression of this research. What you are listening to right now is the soundscape of the day in the life of a dog. As Horowitz and Fox et al. Both argue, in order to understand the world of the dog, we must recognize the sense experiences that make up that world. So while words might fail to fully capture the voice of the dog, the audio recording being played while I read captures some of the sound experiences in their lives, and hopefully effectively disseminates their voice. Project limitations. This research project does entail some limitations. One of the required methods for this research project was the completion of at least 10 hours of participant observation. Despite completing these hours and adhering to my project plan schedule, I believe that expanding on these hours could have allowed for a more expansive understanding of the topic. The dog training that I observed involves a 6-week training program, and observing all 6 training sessions could have been beneficial to this project. By improving the foreplanning of this project and expanding the period over which data collection can take place, this limitation could be overcome. A second limitation has to do with the sample size and diversity of individuals within the research sample. In order to find participants for the survey and the focus group, I used convenience sampling. This meant that all of these responses stem from individuals in the student demographic. Despite the valuable insight that these individuals provided, it would be intriguing to see what the results could be with a more diverse set of responses. This limit could be addressed by approaching more individuals and by preparing the data collection methods earlier to account for finding and collecting feedback from these potential participants. The final limitation is that of my own bias. I am aware that I am writing from subjectivity and positionality whereby I have held a close relationship with dogs for most of my life and have come to view certain practices through ethical and moral lenses. This has also entailed my own practice of anthropomorphizing dogs, which reduces the dog to human understanding. In this project, I have sought to observe, reflect, and disarm my own judgments, and will remain transparent where these judgments override my ability to think relatively. In order to address my tendency to anthropomorphize the dog, I have sought to understand the dog through its own ontology by thinking through the sensorial and embodied experiences of the dog. Decolonial, anti-anthropocentric, and liberatory anthropology. We sit together on a park bench. The sunlight streams down through the openings in the trees and the sound of children playing surrounds us. Banjo, the 1-year-old black miniature schnauzer, wanders around and sniffs the dustbin nearby. Trying to keep an eye on Banjo and answer my questions, Jocelyn calls to him and gently tugs on his retractable lead. Towards the end of the interview, I notice Banjo has become impatient as he nudges his owner's hand and jumps up with his front paws on her lap. I take the hint. My last question is, if you could tell me anything right now, what do you think it would be? Jocelyn laughs and says he would probably want me to know that he would love to be off-leash and running around. At this, Banjo jumps up onto my lap with his tail wagging vigorously. I look down and see his bright brown eyes and cheerful-looking face looking back at me. I ask him, "Is that true?"
I think that's true.
And he barks and licks my hand, confirming my suspicion. Anthropology as a discipline emerged out of the colonial era and was primarily a tool through which the other was created, defined, and problematically and speculatively understood. This othering served to subjugate and dismiss indigenous peoples, non-Eurocentric knowledge, ways of knowing, and ways of being, both in everyday life and in the academic canon. Unfortunately, these practices are still deeply embedded in the way anthropology is practiced today, with limited acknowledgement for the validity of alternative ways of knowing and being. Smith calls for anthropology to consider cosmological connections between people, nature, animals, and the universe at large, and urges the discipline to recognize that these ways of knowing the world are just as valid as empirical knowledge, if not more so, because of their history of being dismissed. Grounded in a colonial ontology that views animals as lesser and distinct beings, for majority of anthropology's existence, anthropologists have viewed animals as nothing more than a resource at the disposal of human research participants, and research participants as nothing more than means to research ends. Just as the concept of the primitive other is used as a foil against which the colonial self forms its identity, Chinati argues that the animal is the foil against which the concept of the human is created. This has meant that there has been little consideration for the validity and value of animal subjectivities, animal knowledge, and animal ways of knowing in the discipline. Additionally, this ideology ignorantly refuses to acknowledge that humans are not a species enclave, but are part of the natural world. We are animals ourselves, and are part of the complex ecosystem that we seek to distinguish ourselves from. It is thus a decolonial project to reframe the way animals are understood and experienced by and through the recentering of indigenous knowledge and ontology in the anthropological discipline. This knowledge argues for the animal as an active agent that is capable of social and epistemological agency. The vignette above captures this agency as the dog Banjo directly communicates with me by making eye contact, licking my hand, barking, and wagging his tail, all of which are universally viewed as legitimate communication strategies in the literature. As Bejarano et al. Argue, decolonial anthropology requires the designing and use of new methods and theories. Through my research project and its focus on a multi-species approach, I hope to have taken steps towards this decolonial mission. This ethnographic research project was born out of a manifesto for an anti-anthropocentric anthropology, meaning an anthropology that seeks to destabilize the human-centric focus of the discipline in an effort to reframe humans as a part of nature. In doing this, anti-anthropocentric anthropology challenges the human-nature dichotomy, which increasingly elevates humans and separates humans from the rest of the natural world. My research focus has been about how dogs are used and assigned purpose within human-dog relationships. Guided by Horowitz, Cherney, Lane, and others, it has been my foremost goal to uplift the dog as a knowledge producer in its own right, and in doing so, proving the dog as valid and valuable research participants. In his paper, Fasson argues for a reimagining of anthropology that focuses on understudied fields, what he calls black holes, and on fields considered mundane. My project addresses both of these desires. Firstly, my research engages in an academic black hole about animal epistemology and ontology. While research about dog behavior has become increasingly popular, this research has lacked the decolonial and indigenous recentering as it is proposed by Belcourt. By studying human-dog relationships through a lens that views the dog as an equal agent and participant, this research naturally challenges the colonial and anthropocentric biases embedded in the anthropological discipline that led to the creation of this black hole. Additionally, because dogs have been a companion species for many years, they have long been considered simple and understood. It is only recently that research has shifted its lens towards understanding this companion species, recognizing that this ordinary part of human life is perhaps far more complex than understood before. As mentioned earlier, this paper will argue that the human assertion of the purpose of the dog is an example of the perpetuation of the human-nature divide, and this divide allows for the growing hierarchy between these categories. In their paper, Bolstorff offers the metaphor of surfing the binary to acknowledge the existence of the binary without allowing it to limit direction and movement. This paper does not argue for such a method. Using multi-species ethnography and anti-anthropocentric anthropology, I have sought to challenge the notion of the human-nature divide that is born of the same colonial biases that taint the anthropological discipline about animal knowledge. The human assertion of a dog's purpose. The sun beams down on me despite the cool winter air, and I continue my walk around the neighborhood looking at the different houses. I am on a mission to understand how people here view their dogs. I cautiously approach a house on my left, taking note of the tiny sign above the doorbell. "Beware of the dog," it says. I look around. I wait. I listen. No dog here. I continue my walk. Another sign. "I am on guard," it says, with the faded image of a German shepherd beside the text. I look around. I wait. I listen. No dog here. I continue my walk. I hear barking ahead of me, and I approach. Behind the driveway gate marches a small black dog. It barks and rushes back and forth and jumps up with its front paws on the gate. Above the dog is a sign, "Beware of the dog. Enter at own risk." I greet the dog, "Hello," and receive the same suspicious barks in response. The dog continues to bark as I move away. I approach another house and see a large golden retriever lying in the sun in the driveway. It barely lifts its head at my presence, and I look around for a sign similar to those I'd seen before, but I do not find one. In her book, Horowitz argues that there is a division in the way people view dogs. Some believe that the dog is at its core a wild animal, while others believe that the dog is a creature of human making. Arguing for the latter, Horowitz states that dogs were once wild animals that have since become animal with an asterisk. That is, animal domesticated. Dogs are believed to have been the first domesticated animal, having been domesticated around 20,000 years ago. This domestication entailed the process of dogs cohabiting and co-evolving alongside humans. It is also argued that during this time the dog developed and acquired social skills akin to that of humans, which, when accompanied by the dog's own agency, allowed for the formation of kinship bonds with humans. Over time, the domestication process has developed into selective breeding, whereby specific features and qualities are intentionally reproduced in dog offspring. Certain dog breeds have become to be associated with different things, including the function and the use of the dog, as well as the image that the dog creates as the expression of identity. Through this process, humans have created and enforced strong boundaries of expectations that assert the purpose of the dog in human life. In this way, it is human culture that determines a dog's social position and status. These boundaries also serve to intensify the differentiation in the human-nature dichotomy. As an example of this from the literature, Cho describes how Tibetan mastiffs are bred to be aggressive and intimidating for pastoral protection in China, and states that great care is taken in this breeding because breeders receive profit for this process. The vignette above serves to demonstrate the different ways that the dog is viewed and assigned purpose in the community that I observed. As I will discuss later, two ways that a dog is assigned purpose is either through the flexible personhood of being a family companion, and the other is through the weaponization of the dog. In the case of the houses that had signs but no dog present, the dog is used as an image to ward off possible intruders. Even in its absence, the dog serves the purpose of protection. This purpose of protection is further exemplified in the case of the house that had both a sign and a barking dog. It is likely that the protective behavior is encouraged and expected, and combined with the use of a sign, demonstrates that this dog too has been assigned the purpose of protection. In the final case of the Golden Retriever, the lack of sign, its breed, and its behavior indicates that this dog has been assigned a companion role. The idea that different breeds are and should be associated with specific behaviors, uses, and sentiments was a common theme throughout my data collection. Firstly, the choice to train the dog for personal protection is one that assigns the dog a specific purpose. Many of the dog owners I met deliberately bought and raised their dogs for this purpose. Not only this, but it was clear that certain breeds were prioritized for this work over others. I observed that all of the dogs in this class were either Belgian Malinois or German Shepherds. In my interview with Jennifer, the personal protection dog trainer and dog owner, she expressed that certain breeds simply have a natural interest and instinct for doing protection work. I also conducted an interview with Beth, a dog owner and trainer who does the manwork or protection sport. This is similar to the protection dog training, except the dog is taught to focus on the equipment, not people, and is able to compete in the sport. Beth expressed that her dog, a Bouvier de Flandre, was intentionally bred in Holland for the purpose of doing the sport. She argued that, for him, it's almost hardwired that this is the game he likes to play. On the other side of the spectrum are the dogs who are chosen and bred for their gentle and friendly temperaments. Jocelyn, the owner of the young miniature schnauzer, Banjo, expressed that she got this breed because it is famously family-friendly. So, it is clear that dogs are bred with specific traits in mind and are assigned purpose by humans according to these desired traits. Additionally, it was commonly expressed throughout my research that maintaining control over the dog, being responsible for it, and asserting which behaviors were acceptable were all aspects of what it meant to be a dog owner. In my interview with Marcus, a dog owner, he expressed that maintaining a power dynamic was important in his relationships with his dogs, because this meant he could better control his dog's unfavorable behaviors. His dog, Maxie, has some anxiety around other dogs and has attacked dogs before. For Marcus, controlling her reactions is an unfortunate consequence of protecting her and other dogs from harm. During my research, I noticed that directing and deciding what behavior is acceptable ranged from formally training the dog to tugging on the dog's lead to tell the dog to move on its walk. These examples serve to demonstrate that it is not only in the assigning of purpose that humans implement a hierarchy over dogs, but it is also in the methods through which this purpose is assigned and practiced that this hierarchy is asserted. Through the domestication and incorporation of dogs into human life, humans have created boundaries of conceptual difference in the nature-human divide. the assigning of flexible personhood unto dogs and the weaponization of dogs are two ways that this boundary is enforced.
The provision of flexible personhood for companionship. We both watch Banjo as he sniffs the ground around Jocelyn's feet. "Have you done any training with him?" I ask, drawing her attention back to the interview. "A little," she says, "but he is very spoilt. He's the child of the house." We both laugh, which causes Banjo to get excited, and he whips his head around to look at his owner. When she does not react, he sniffs the air and watches the people passing by behind us. A little while later, Jocelyn tells me that part of the reason she got a small dog was because a bigger dog would be a burden if she and her husband went on holiday and the dog had to stay with her family. Some time passes, and I watch as she absent-mindedly strokes Banjo's head. I ask her if humans have a responsibility to dogs. She scrunches her face and inspects Banjo's. "Obviously, our own dogs. We need to take care of them like a family member, as you would take care of a kid who can't take care of themselves," she says. As I argued in my introduction, one way that the human-nature divide is perpetuated by the human assertion of the dog's purpose is through the provision of flexible personhood unto the dog. Flexible personhood, as described by Shervitesh, is a quality given to pets so that they are transformed and recognized as individuals with personhood when they are incorporated into the family. This allows humans to recognize the pet as a familial equal, an active social agent, and often entails the animal being treated like a human child.
Busy making their dinner.
The incorporation of dogs as family members is an increasingly popular trend in South Africa. These animals are loved and assimilated into human life and the familial home, but the quality of flexible personhood is fluid and adaptive to the social conditions and the changing ways of life of the human owner. So this means that by recognizing the animal as more than an animate object, but as a pet, this assigned personhood can be partially stripped away or stripped away in its entirety from the animal by the human owner. Haraway argues that this personhood and label of pet does more to demean the animal than uplift it, which leaves room for abandonment when humans lose interest or their social life changes. Viewing the dog in this way does not account for the agency and valid ontology of the animal. The dog, under the label as flexible person, is granted the opportunity to take part in kinship relations and partnerships with humans, while never being fully recognized as social agent or entire person. In their paper, Hand speaks about the way care shapes their kinship relation with their dog Frank, who is not just the receiver of this care, but also an equal contributor to the relation. Similarly, Lane writes about her reciprocal relationship with her dog, who acts as a social mediator during her own ethnographic research. Cherney argues that these kin relations also entail a flow of knowledge between the dog and the human, as both navigate the social dynamic of their kinship. Unfortunately, despite this dynamism and the validity of these relations, the dog, because of the flexible personhood that it is ascribed, is undermined by these very same relations. Even when incorporated into the family, the dog remains in its legal status as property, making it so that the human it is related to maintains the title and responsibility of owner. Not only this, the owner, who has the power to assign and terminate personhood, names the dog, trains it, assigns the dog a purpose, and asserts expected behaviors on the animal. Sadly, the dog, who has become so deeply enmeshed in human life, is forced into a corner of ultimate dependency on humans. This is further intensified by the human manipulation of the natural world and the environmental degradation that we have caused, making it so that the dog is dependent on a self-destructing species.
In the vignette above, I narrated part of an interview I had with dog owner Jocelyn. In this vignette, we discussed the incorporation of her dog into her family. Banjo, the dog, actively took part in the interview, interrupting occasionally to bark, sniff, observe, and be petted. Initially, Jocelyn describes how the dog is seen and treated like a human child. From our interview, I'm given to understand that he gets his way most of the time, and that she and her husband assert little authority over him like other dog owners seem to do. Just as Vitesh explained, the dog has incorporated into the family and is loved as an equal family member. This is the first time Banjo's personhood is demonstrated for me in this conversation. However, later in the interview, Jocelyn describes the dog as a potential burden, reshaping his identity in her mind from that of kin to animate object. Despite only just ascribing the dog personhood, Jocelyn demonstrates that this personhood is fluid and flexible, and in scenarios that extend beyond their intimate kin relation, the dog can be seen to be stripped of its social agency. Moments later, Jocelyn reassigns this personhood to the dog as she expresses the need to care for one's own dog as one would care for a family member. Within one conversation, the human assigned, terminated, and reassigned personhood to the dog. This is a stark example of the flexibility of pet personhood, and the ease with which this personhood can be controlled by the human that owns the dog.
There's builders outside my window.
The weaponization of dogs for protection. With the personal protection training class due to begin soon, I notice several dogs and their owners arriving at the training center and begin preparing for the class. I approach a dog owner and her Belgian Malinois. Both the owner and the dog stand tall and alert of their surroundings, although the owner is far more relaxed than the dog. The owner is friendly and tells me that the dog is a female of about 22 months. The dog is wearing a black jacket that reads "Service Dog" and "Do Not Pet," and has a thick black collar with a small box attached to it around its neck. I notice that the owner is wearing a lanyard with a small remote control on it. I ask what these are. "Shark collar," she says, to control her. I resist every urge to question the ethics of such a tool and instead ask why she does this training with her dog. She tells me that training the dog for this is purely for her safety, and when asked about using other forms of protection such as mace, she scoffs and says that the dog is all she needs. All throughout our conversation, the dog has been staring at one of the crew members from the training center, shaking with excitement as she does so. The owner informs me that she is actually staring at the bag that contains the bite work kit, and I observe with interest the absolute intensity with which the dog does this. Combined with the owner's boasts that she could make the dog bite anyone if she wanted to, this strange intensity had me taking a few cautious steps back, just in case. The second way that I observed humans assigning purpose to dogs is through the weaponization of dogs, either for protection or to create a threatening image. Haraway argues that dogs have served many functions throughout history, one of these being as a lethal guided weapon and instrument of terror. In other words, dogs have habitually been weaponized against other humans to control movement, instill fear, and to torture. They have also served to protect individuals and property, as demonstrated by the pastoral protection of Tibetan Mastiffs discussed by Cho. According to Swart, the choice of dog breed is associated with identity creation and the desires and anxieties of the dog owner. This means that, for the most part, when one adopts a certain dog breed, one does this knowing the cultural and social ideas that surround such a breed. If chosen for its breed and perceived purpose intentionally, these ideas are asserted as part of or in protection of one's identity. In their paper, Jaffe and DeConning argue that beware the dog signs reflect defensive urbanism, which is the use of infrastructure to discourage access and use of public spaces. These signs, with the image of the dog attached, reflect society's views on dogs as potential weapons and threats for human use. In the vignette above, the dog owner made it explicit that she was training her dog for her own protection. When asked whether she had other dogs, she said that she did, but those dogs were more like family dogs, thus making a clear distinction for the purpose and expectations of the dog she was training. I believe that her use of the shock collar to control a dog is an indication of the dog's tendency to ignore commands, especially once her natural instinct and prey drive have kicked in, making it so that the shock collar was the only way to direct the dog's behavior. And it is an indication of the dog owner's desire to control the dog and acutely direct the dog's behavior. The dog owner's boasting about her ability to direct the dog to bite any individual with ease, and the dog's intense focus on the bite work kit, both speak volumes of how intricately the weaponization of the dog has become enmeshed in their social relation. The dog is not only expected to protect the owner, but is also a directable weapon at her disposal. In my data collection, I found that dogs were weaponized in two ways. The first is as forms of protection that bear similarities to other weapons such as guns or knives when they are used for personal protection. In my interview with Jennifer, the personal protection dog trainer, she expressed that training the dogs for personal protection was not by any means weaponizing them. She said that she understood weaponized dogs as those trained to be unnecessarily aggressive with the purpose of instilling fear. However, she also claimed that a trained personal protection dog is just like a gun or a knife and should only be used when absolutely necessary. There is a clear discrepancy in these two claims, because even when used in self-defense, guns and knives are weapons that have the potential to cause a lot of harm. Similarly, even if the dog is only disarming an attacker, the very training of the dog to do this is an act of weaponization. The second way dogs are weaponized is through their image as threats against people, where even the idea of the dog is enough to deter harm. It was a shared and common experience for many of the research participants that having a dog with them while walking helped them feel safer. One of my participants told me, "You are safer with a dog with you," and proceeded to demonstrate how he shortens the leash when passing someone he is suspicious of, in order to make the dog seem highly trained and thus more threatening. There was also a shared sentiment for the use of dogs for this threatening image by vulnerable individuals, especially single women in South Africa, and especially anxious and fearful individuals. In my data collection, I observed that the dog also works to ward off and instill fear in potential attackers, making it so that it is not just the dog that is weaponized, but also the idea and image of the dog that is weaponized. Ndaba argues that dogs are a way in which narratives of violence are remembered. However, they are also a way that violence is enacted. The historical use of dogs as weapons against humans is inconsolable and unforgivable. The man who runs and owns the Canine Training Center started training dogs in 1987, which was a big feat for a man of color in apartheid. He told me that he believed civilians should be able to train and be protected by their own dogs, and not only controlled by their fear of militarized dogs. In saying this, he was expressing that training dogs for personal protection is about more than just protection. It is liberatory. When he began his work, his community held the belief that dogs could only speak Afrikaans. And so, by teaching in English, this trainer works to challenge the limitations and weight of apartheid's history. Conclusion. The human-nature divide is one that has become so entrenched in the way we understand the world around us that we tend to forget that humans are also a part of the natural world. With its roots in colonialism, anthropology is guilty of contributing to this misconception, as it is inherently anthropocentric. As a discipline, it prioritizes human participants and often views animals and the natural world as nothing more than resources at the disposal of these participants. In recent years, and because of the decolonial project, there has been a call to address these ideologies through an indigenous lens. Indigenous cosmologies view animals as persons with social agency, subjectivity, and epistemology. Through this project, I have sought to challenge the human-nature divide and put to practice an anti-anthropocentric anthropology. In this essay, I have discussed human-dog relationships and have shown that when humans assert the purpose of dogs, we do so often for our own benefit, under the misconception that dogs are somehow lesser in a hierarchy that prioritizes the human. In my research, the assertion of the purpose of the dog arose in two forms. The first is through the provision of flexible personhood so as to incorporate the dog as a family member. And the second is through the weaponization of dogs for protection. In the former, the dog is provided with a form of personhood that transforms them from animal to family member so that they can be fully incorporated into the family. However, this personhood is adaptive to human ways of life and comes with the caveat that the human has the ability to strip the dog of its personhood just as easily and as swiftly as it was initially given. On the latter assertion of the purpose, the dog is assigned the purpose of protection and is weaponized through training, as it actively protects and attacks under the human's command. The dog is also weaponized through the use of the dog to instill fear in perceived and potential threats, simply by being present, or in its absence by being suggested. In both of these purposes, the dog is not recognized for its agency and subjectivity, as the dog owners use these methods to define a conceptual difference that distinguishes them from the dog. The very fact that humans are able to and actively do use dogs without recognizing these things demonstrates how deeply entrenched the human-nature divide has become in our common understanding of the world. By challenging this dichotomy and the colonial underpinnings of anthropology as I have done in this project, we are brought steps closer to reuniting humanity with the natural world.